So welcome everyone on this Thursday afternoon to our Tempter class in Museum and Heritage Studies. My name is Anna Lawrenson. I'm the current Director of Museum and Heritage Studies. I'm going to give a short presentation with my colleague from Museum and Heritage Studies, Dr. Chiara O'Reilly. We both teach into the program. We are both located in art history, so I guess in terms of our split between Museum and Heritage Studies, we come from more of a museum studies side of things. So the examples we talk about this evening will be related to that. I also teach collaboratively, we teach collaboratively across the program, but I teach a number of subjects with Chiara and we work together as well. So this has informed our collaborative approach to this afternoon's presentation. The digital pivot, connecting with community in the age of COVID. Once we finish, we're really lucky to have colleagues from the Chau Chak Wing Museum on campus who are going to take us through some of their approaches to online engagement. So we have Jane Thorgerson and Eve Curie who are going to, as I said, show us some of the collection at the Chau Chak Wing Museum and take us through their object-based learning workshops. After that, there'll also be an opportunity for questions. So please, if you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat throughout and we'll come back to them when we get to the end of the session. So as I said, thank you so much everyone for coming along. Of course, before we do move into the content, I would like to acknowledge that we are a distributed group who are all located on First Nations lands. I'm located coming to you this evening from the Jerrinja lands of the Yuin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I think it's an immense privilege to be on country and to have that opportunity to learn and care for country. So I appreciate if people also acknowledge the country on which they're coming from. All right, so to a little bit of background. As I said, Chiara and I work quite closely together, and one of the projects that we are working on in a research capacity is a project called Museums as Sites of Civil Society. In addition to this project, Chiara and I have co-authored a book on blockbuster exhibitions in Australia. We've done a number of papers together on audiences and engagement in museums, and these things have influenced our focus today. So this paper in particular draws on this project, Museums as Sites of Civil Society, which is a broad project looking at how museums actually serve communities. Part of this project has been developed in association with industry partners, Museums and Galleries New South Wales, and also now Wagga Wagga Regional Art Gallery. So it investigates this question of how museums serve society through three lenses: organisational leadership, sustainability principles, and audience engagement. Today, our discussion is focused primarily on audience engagement strategies, and in particular in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're interested in exploring how museums and galleries served their communities by seeking out unique ways to engage with them and indeed support them during this time of fear and uncertainty. We began with the question of how can museums create a shared space for deeper engagement, even intimacy, between the institution and the visitor during this time of physical distancing. So we're particularly interested in the intersections between theory and practice, and this has really informed how we approach this paper, to find out where the aspirations of museums as institutions that serve society can actually be identified in practice. And so this nexus between theory and practice is something that we explore as a methodology in Museum and Heritage Studies that we really bring into our teaching program, looking at the way, as I said, best practice and theory are actually evident in and often leading projects in the sector.
Thanks, Anna. It's lovely to be here today. So Our paper was, of course, inspired by what is a unique set of circumstances that's impacted everyone here over almost the last 2 years. Because during this time, we heard about the importance repeatedly of physical visitors, both to the business model of museums and galleries, but also in terms of their fundamental purpose. And this is really our base assumption, I suppose, with museums generally. But the importance of physical visitors to institutions is a sort of conceptual barrier that's perpetuated the assumption that without in-person visitors, museums and galleries were in a state of inertia. Cloaked, as you see in this lovely photograph from the Sydney Morning Herald, in under wraps. So that were a whole series of news stories, just like this one, about the unveiling of collections and the reactivation of these physical spaces once visits were made possible again. And that for Anna and I, this really deflects attention away from an extraordinary amount of activity that took place while the doors of museums and galleries were closed to visitors. Because for many institutions, this was a time of phenomenal productivity and innovation. And that's really what we're interested in talking about today.
Thanks, Chiara. So in researching the various ways that museums and galleries continue to engage with communities throughout the pandemic, and in particular during periods of lockdown when physical visits weren't possible, we've identified 3 factors that we think characterise some of the most meaningful engagement that sought to address the needs of community during the pandemic. So firstly, museums pivoted their offerings to generate intimate experiences that fulfilled community needs resulting from the isolation of lockdowns. They modulated their voice, and often that was some of the most charming engagements that we saw between museums and communities. So they modulated their voice to become trusted friends, sharing the experience and providing support during this difficult time. And thirdly, they sought to maintain connections with existing audiences. And of course, it's of prime importance during these periods where physical visits weren't possible. But the digital pivot also enabled them to extend beyond those existing audiences through online platforms. So what we would like to do in our little Tempter paper is to show some international examples in these 3 areas: intimacy, voice and connection, and then compare these to some of the innovation that was seen in the Australian museum sector. So the first one that we've got in relation to intimacy is an example from the Frick Museum, Cocktails with a Curator. For people who have not been to the Frick, and I think it's a rather niche institution, it is probably one of our elite kind of museums par excellence. So it's in a Manhattan mansion. It's a private collection which has been made accessible. And this Curators with a Cocktail was one of the really very quick responses to the closing of the doors. So the Frick closed quite early in response to the lockdowns and the pandemic. And they created this event, this intimate event, pitching it as an evening event to share with a key staff member from the Frick. It happened every week from April 2020 and continued through until July 2021. And quite literally, people were invited into the homes of curators, and there's, as you can see in the slide here, it was a very casual kind of staging. The curators chose an object from the collection that they felt really strongly about, and it was that personal sort of voice and that intimate discussion around why they loved a particular work in the collection that really provided the charm for this event. And it was cocktails. It was at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So all of the discussions were paired with a cocktail, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, as for your preference. But again, thinking of that idea of having Friday afternoon drinks and the kind of physical things that people were missing during lockdown. what we think is really successful about this, of course, is that idea of intimacy, being invited into somebody's home, having a personal conversation, but also that it really maximised access to the collection and to the knowledge bound up in curators around that collection. It was a live event. It was a free event. Conceivably, you could sit at home in your pyjamas and witness this or engage with this event, which I think really extends that idea of the kind of intimacy of the experience. It was also a highly successful endeavour. So each of the weekly sessions, they rarely had under 1,000 people viewing. Of course, those videos that they created are enduring, so they are still available online. But as one of the curators commented, the number of emails that come to us that say, I'm very sick, I'm very old, or I'm never going to get on a plane to come to New York. So there was a real sense of gratitude and thanks for bringing the Frick into my home. And I think that really characterises that idea of intimacy that we're interested in. And importantly, I think it has set a standard, a benchmark for the Frick to now build upon, where they're looking at other online platforms to extend their engagement. So particularly they're looking at TikTok as the next platform that they're going to approach, which for a very sort of austere and traditional institution like the Frick is quite a shift.
So my slide here is about voice, which is the next of our themes. Now, a really standard response by collecting institutions was, of course, to digitise their physical exhibition space and load those onto the internet to make them available to people. My example is from the Science Gallery in Dublin, which took on a really proactive and very carefully decided path around how they would use their voice and the sort of voice that they would seek to establish with the community during the lockdowns and the impacts of COVID. So they developed quite quickly a response that was an open outdoors exhibit, because they realized they'd be closed for an extended period of time, called The Speed of Science. And the reason that Anna and I have selected this is we thought that it was such a significant example of an institution using their voice as a trusted authority to address questions that were arising for the community now, so that this exhibit and the online offer that accompanied it allowed them to address questions about the virus itself, about immune systems, and also the path and the science behind vaccination. And I think that this is about using the museum's voice as a platform that would have immediate community benefit, because it was in response to the questions that were happening in the community and addressing that through the space of the museum and through the voice of the museum. So not only was there exhibition on the streets of Dublin, but it was then supported by a wider online project that made the content and the discussions and the research accessible to a much wider audience. So that they were looking at, they had a series of podcasts, for example, that were interviews with scientists or people talking about the virus and how it works, talking about concepts like herd immunity, all those sorts of conversations that the community needs a trusted voice. They also developed a citizen science project, which ran this year, which involved community and school groups and gave authority to those community voices to think about their own experience of COVID and the sort of impacts that it was having on community. And I think one of the things that the Science Gallery has always been so successful at doing is inserting humour and personal narratives into the equation. And so that we saw that in this temporary display, where there were Lego figurines with bits of string that explained herd immunity, but there were also opportunities for the community to put in their own stories and have their own engagement with these sorts of things, so that it was a really important voice that the museum sought to activate in response to the pandemic. Sorry. This is our example for connection, which Anna and I utterly adored, and many of you may have seen last year. It's still ongoing. This was, I think, one of the most prominent ways that we saw museums connecting with audience. It was through collections during this period of physical isolation. And the thing that was really interesting about this response was that it actually wasn't generated by museums, but it was actually generated, I think, from memory by a bunch of flatmates who came up with the concept while they were sort of kicking around in lockdown of responding to collection items using things around their own home. The Tusen Kunsten quarantine project. The thing that's so interesting and that I think shows the kind of change in museums that was happening across COVID was that museums quite quickly jumped on this as an opportunity and harnessed it and leveraged it in their own ways. So these are examples that are generated as part of the Getty Museums Challenge in the United States. They quite quickly responded to this challenge. A whole series of their staff responded by posting their own pics of collection items. And that then created this fantastic platform on Twitter where the community was responding and feeding in their own relationship to the gallery and to their collection. It had a number of things that were really in its favour. For the Getty, it was an important opportunity where they recognised that part of their response to the pandemic had to be shaped by a desire to do something that would uplift the community, that would be about inspiration and that would actually create a community. Something like this challenge had a formidably low bar to entry. There's a lot of art in the position of those toilet rolls, but it's relatively low cost. But it's been phenomenally successful for the Getty. So we know, for example, that they generated something like 120,000 new Instagram followers as a result of this project and 18,000 new Facebook friends. Another aspect that's really interesting that came out of this project and is about this kind of this search for new connection and the way that the pandemic actually allowed institutions to reinforce their connection but build new connections was that the public actually requested a book of the best of these objects or of the best of these products. And so the Getty responded very quickly. It was published last year. There's a lovely coffee table book that pulls together the best of them. And that from the funds that are raised from that, the Getty is donating back to charities supporting artists. So you can see it's this great example of a kind of a cycle of connection that's new, imaginative, but reinforces really profound links.
Thanks, Chiara. So that left us to think, okay, well, given the regional differences in Australia, both in terms of our experience of the pandemic and our response to the pandemic, how did institutions in Australia respond? And I think that there were quite a number of differences. However, we think that these concepts of intimacy, voice and connection actually endured across a good many of the engagements that we saw in the Australian museum and gallery sector, and certainly a good many of the most interesting examples. So just to take you really quickly through a few, because I know we're watching the time. In terms of intimacy, one of the interesting platforms that Chiara and I have been following is the Together in Art platform at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. So you can see here the quote from Maud Page: "More than a virtual exhibition space, it's an open platform of imagination, inspiration and creativity that really uses the collection as a springboard, but is looking at a much more sort of active engagement with that collection." So it allowed the gallery to invite artists in to commission. They commissioned videos from their studios at home. You can see here a lovely image of Tony Albert with his niece, his niece Bree, who presented one of these videos. There were lots of hands-on opportunities for the audience to get creative in response to these videos. So there was another one with Ben Quilty and his daughter, who were teaching people how to draw portraits. And I think that social aspect of it two people paired together really reflected the kind of situation that many people were in at home during that period of lockdown, where there were families together trying to figure out new ways of engaging with each other, being together 24 hours a day. So I think that there were these ones in particular were focused at children, but there were other examples that were focused more at an adult market. So with the galleries closed, for example, there was an opportunity to create videos in the gallery space that enabled the type of intimate experience that you wouldn't necessarily get during the hubbub of opening times. So concerts in the gallery, more intimate tours and the like. So I think these are some interesting ways that breaking down some of that kind of austerity often of galleries through these little vignettes. In terms of voice, we couldn't go past, again, referencing the Art Gallery of New South Wales, thinking about the way that institutions took on the role of a trusted friend, kind of embodying that notion that we're all in this together. We saw that manifested in a number of ways, but the Art Gallery of New South Wales took a very light-hearted approach to that, which played on lockdown fatigue and was particularly kind of welcome and well received in the most recent lockdown in New South Wales. So here you're looking at their Twitter feed down on the bottom, dialing in to the prophecy meeting, and they tell you you're on mute. I think we've all experienced being on mute in a Zoom, really addressing those everyday kind of learnings that people have had to undertake during this period of the pandemic. Other examples where we see that voice of the institution changed. Institutions like the National Gallery of Victoria had a Spotify playlist, a series of Spotify playlists, which were your soundtrack to lockdown. And again, they were personal. There was one, for example, which was the National Gallery of Victoria's publications editor. And she had created a playlist which was the soundtrack to her lockdown. So songs that she would listen to on her walks, on her working from home, etc. So again, personalising that idea of the experience of lockdown, but also really building that idea of the multifaceted voice of the institution rather than that overarching, broad, authoritative voice. Most recently, the Museum of Contemporary Art has launched a really interesting project, which is the Phone and Artwork project. Again, thinking of that idea of the voice, visitors or audience members are invited to book a 5 to 10 minute phone call where you actually ring up the institution and you get a one-on-one conversation about a work from the collection. So again, thinking about how that postmodern idea of the new museology and incorporating different perspectives and different voices into institutions, we've actually seen that played out really very adeptly during this pandemic across multiple platforms.
Thanks, Anna. So the final example that we're going to share with you is relates to connection. And many institutions, I think, in Australia, just like those internationally, sought to, in really quite imaginative ways, to think about how they could connect with their communities and how they could really serve their communities. And it was very much multi-pronged. It was not just about intellectual engagement or engagement with the collection, but it was also frequently about providing practical support. So the Art Gallery of New South Wales had great success sending out kids' art packs. Sydney Living Museum sent out books to members. But the two examples that I've got here are examples. The example on the right is from the State Library of New South Wales, and I'll come to that, while the example on the left is from the Yarra Plenty Library. And they, they did some amazing work. They're a really interesting group of libraries that service the northeast region in Melbourne. Of course, Melbourne has had the misfortune to endure multiple lockdowns. So they have continually refined their offer. But one of the things that I thought was really wonderful that this library really sought to do, and did very quickly in the experience, was that they activated the library network and made sure that they were addressing their community in quite a holistic way. They offered online classes, they had daily story time sessions, they had workshops, they had video tutorials, all sorts of things. They also organised care boxes. So you remember in Melbourne, the lockdown or multiple lockdowns was quite a small kilometre radius that you were allowed to travel. So many in the community were unable to visit even their local library for the click and collect. So one of the responses at the Yarra Plenty Library was that you could fill in a form online and they'd put together a care box. You'd say what your interests were, and a librarian would walk around, pick the books off the shelf, and they would be either delivered to your home if you were outside the area, or you'd be able to click and collect. They also offered that with a real focus on families. They also loaned out dongles to make sure that the very marginal in their community were able to access all of the internet offer. So I think that's really important. One of the extraordinary things that they did was they activated a program that they called Caring Calls, where they sent their staff home at lockdown with a phone. And they downloaded the list of all their users, and they identified at every user over 70 who engages with the library, and someone rang every member in the community. Some of those chats were just putting them in with saying, hello, how are you going? But a lot of those chats actually connected those community members to further services and support. So it was quite an extraordinary project. The State Library in New South Wales also quite quickly responded to the pandemic and the limits of lockdown. They run two children's programs, an art club and a writers club. And I've got some examples from the art club. But the thing that Anna and I were quite charmed by these offers is that they were live webinars. They were fortnightly events where the children would be sent an invite. The art club is themed so that each week you encounter a different work in the collection. And then there are a series of drawings. And it is incredibly personalised, because in the webinar, Andrea, who hosts the session, asks the children to introduce themselves. She asks them, what do they make of it? How would they want to draw? And she invites them to send in their art. And at the start of every session, she shows all the art that's been sent in. And it's really gone a long way, I think, to creating a community. And one of the things that I think is true of all of these online offers is that it's no longer serving the immediate community, but a global community, so that people from all over the world have been engaging with the State Library of New South Wales project. You know, the cocktails with the curator, we've all been able to do. So that there's been this fantastic shift in how we service, but the really great sense of connection has been reinforced by the activities of these libraries to really build their community and support their community very actively.
Thank you, Chiara. We know that there's quite a quick kind of romp through of some of our examples of these ideas of voice, connection and intimacy. But I think it's really important to highlight that although this has been a really challenging 2 years almost now for many institutions, it's also revealed a great many opportunities that can be found in the online space as not a new space, but certainly a reconfigured and a reimagined space in direct response to the pandemic. So it's allowed institutions to explore different ways that they can engage with visitors in these, you know, more intimate ways with a more casual voice. I think to have the bravery to take on that casual kind of tone has been a real triumph, I think, of the response to the pandemic. And as I said earlier, I think is very much embodying this postmodern idea of a multi-perspectival institution that incorporates many voices. And of course, reinforcing those new connections that we hope will be sustained when we do get back to a much more familiar form of engagement with institutions. So I'm going to say thank you. As I said, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so do feel free to pop questions in the chat. But of course, I'm going to now hand over to Eve and Jane from the Chau Chak Wing Museum, who have been battling all of these same hurdles through the Chau Chak Wing Museum. And I think key to a lot of the examples Chiara and I discussed was the centrality of the collection and the collecting areas of these institutions. So we're really looking forward to hearing about the great work Chau Chak Wing Museum has been doing as well.
Thank you, Anna. Now I'm just confirming, because it's 25 to Gillian, how long do you want to give me now? How long should we leave for the discussion at the end?
I think if we allow about 10 minutes at the end, that would be fine.
10 minutes at the end? Okay, sounds good. All right, so we'll finish at 10 to. We'll whiz through our section as well. So, there we go. Okay. I assume that's working and everyone can see my screen. Fantastic. All right, so thank you for that. We're now going to bring you in about 15 minutes the Chau Chak Wing Museum as a case study for this digital pivot. That was our brief, so let's see how we go with that. And I will, of course, first also like to acknowledge that I am zooming in today from Gadigal country, and I acknowledge and pay respect to the tradition of custodianship and law of this Gadigal country that I'm on today, and also that the University of Sydney campuses and indeed the Chau Chak Wing Museum is standing on. And Jane today is joining us from Darkinjin land. And I pay my respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. And I also would like to acknowledge the very important responsibility that the Chau Chak Wing Museum has in caring for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections that are in our care, as well as the material culture of First Nations from around the world. And we try to be respectful in everything that we do for these collections. So very quickly, the museum only opened in November last year. And we've had a few different forms of how we need to prepare ourselves and present ourselves in this age of COVID. So when the museum first opened, it was the age of COVID, but we were open, and we even had semester 1 this year where there were COVID restrictions, but the museum was open. And then, of course, we had lockdown 2.0. So when we talk about the digital pivot, we've got a few different formats of what we've had to do over the last 12 months. And a lot of the job that Jane and I do as the Academic Engagement Curators is working with the collections usually that are not on display. So there's only about 3% on display, then we're usually dipping into the other 97% of the collection for object handling classes. So being online means we've got access to 100% of the collections all the time. And as Anna and Chiara have been saying, it really does place the emphasis on the collection items themselves and what we can do with them, and the presence of a digital object, the aura of the digital object, how it can be useful. We're really lucky to have a very diverse multidisciplinary collection. So the Chau Chak Wing Museum brings together what was formerly 3 on-campus museums. The Macleay collection holds natural history and ethnography and historic photography and scientific instrument collections, fascinating collection. The art collection is art and design mediums from about the 12th century until today. And those artworks are from Australia, but are also all around the world. And then the Nicholson collection is the collection of antiquities, the archaeological collection of ancient material culture from ancient Egypt and Greece and Rome, Cyprus, the Indus Valley, and the ancient Near East. Those are the main focus points of the Nicholson collection, and it also includes human remains as well as animal and environmental remains. So this is the fertile ground that Jane and I have for teaching with collections. And it was a very unexpected challenge for us to do an object-based learning program, which is what we run, in the purely digital world. So before we look at how we did that, just a quick overview of the different things that happen at the Chau Chak Wing Museum that had to reinvent themselves for the lockdown that we've just come out of. So for the general public, obviously the museum was closed and access was via the website where there's an online collection search. There's also a podcast and things like that. Public programs became obviously all online, and there was an email campaign to promote all of the talks, that are a very rich offering of talks that were available online and people could join remotely. Of course, there was an upside to some of these needing to be delivered online, and it does make us wonder what's never going back, what will never change again. So for example, they were all recorded, so even if you couldn't make the session, you can go and watch the talk later. And I think Anna was talking about people who noted that they had mobility issues and wouldn't have been able to attend if it were in person. Another really big thing was there was no number restrictions. So even when the museum was open, we still had square meter rules and number restrictions. And even if there wasn't that, there would still be a capacity limit in the auditorium. But having these public programs online meant that there were many more people. And they, of course, they were a much more global audience. So I think that's something quite special that we didn't have before, that people could join from around the country and even from around the world. So the museum is actually open again now. You can go and visit the museum. So we are open with COVID restrictions, but tours have not restarted yet. So everything is, for now, staying online, except that you can go visit in person. School programs, of course, were very severely affected. And I think the focus moved to creating online resources for the school groups, and that will pick up again next year when we're open. But what I'm here to talk to you today about is the Academic Engagement Program. So that is the program that my colleague Jane and I run together. And we call it the Object-Based Learning Program because we are connecting with students and staff at the University of Sydney to engage them with their collections and to integrate the collections into units of study and into teaching and into research, into assignments, wherever it can take place. So just a quick snapshot of some of our activities from semester one, and you can see that they are all very much grounded in the museum, in the space. And while the focus is on the objects, it's also about being in the museum, and it's about that tactile, kinesthetic experience of handling the object, of having that moment of connection. So we had our work cut out for us with this so-called digital pivot, because we found that in semester one, we met this new breed of hybrid classes or high flex classes, where some students were in the room handling artifacts and other students were joining in from the screen, and we had to make that still immersive and engaging and participatory. And then in semester two, we had 100% and are still having 100% of our teaching online. So what have we done? I'm going to go very, very quickly through some of the tools that we've been able to use. The online collection search, of course, has been our most important thing, as well as a growing archive of 3D models of the collections. The podcasts that take a bit of a depth look at one object at a time have been very useful, as well as 360-degree image capture. So it's like a virtual tour inside the exhibition spaces. So that allows us to access the exhibitions as well as the actual objects, the collection items together. And we've used a combination of these in all of the classes that we've run. So in semester two, so it's part of the age of COVID, but it's when the museum was open. We saw just over 11,000 participants come through the Object-Based Learning Program. And even at that time when we were open, just over half of that was remote delivery. So it's very much a 50-50, slightly in the favor of students choosing to join remotely anyway. That's even when the museum is open. And you can see there's a spread from lots of different disciplines, the lion's share in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Oops. And then, and this is just showing you that we've got, no joke, it was square on 500 teaching hours from semester one. And these are the sessions. And then, you know, when you take into account all the repeat sessions, this was our activities in semester one. In semester two, It's dropped a little bit, but not as much as you would have thought. So we're nearly at the end of semester 2 now, and we're getting up around that 8,000 to 10,000 participants still, and that's despite 100% being remote delivery. So what are we doing with these students? What do we do in the room, and what can we do when it's online instead? The key skills that we teach in the object-based learning program are behind everything that we do. So sometimes we're doing deep object analysis and discipline-specific in-depth content study. Sometimes it's more the skills that we're teaching, but whether it's implicit or explicit, every time we're working with objects, the students are honing their observation skills, critical analysis and deductive reasoning, and then their ability to communicate what they see to others, as well as working on that knowledge retention and motivation for further inquiry. That's what we're really on about. So to show you a little example of how this works, and to make this a little bit of a practical session, even though we only have 5 minutes, we're going to do a little activity now. And Jane and I like to try new things all the time. So we're going to try something that we haven't exactly done before, and it might not work. So we hope that it will. And I am going to ask if I can have 2 volunteers, please, to perhaps raise your hand. And I am going to set a couple of breakout rooms. And I'm going to sign manually. Okay. Now, do I have any volunteers that want to put up their digital hand? I'm looking for someone who's brave, someone who thinks they're quite good at observation and very good at communication. I only need 2 people, and there's about 50 of us here.
Or you could just be someone who doesn't want to draw.
Who have we got? Who's game for this practical demonstration of the type of things that Jane and I have been doing for digital object-based learning? Thank you, Timothy. Fantastic. Okay, Timothy, I'm going to pop you in to breakout room 1. Thank you very much. And then I just need 1 more brave person.
Bronwyn.
Bronwyn, okay, fantastic. Thank you, Bronwyn. Okay, all right. So Timothy and Bronwyn, I'm about to send you into breakout rooms. Everybody else, please stay in the main room and have a nice chat. I am going to send you, Jane, into room 2, and I'll send myself into room 1 in a moment. Everyone who's in the main room, can you please use this time to get out paper and something to draw with? And then also, if you've got a phone or something handy that's a different device to the one you're zooming on, get that out as well. Okay, let's open these rooms.
Hi everyone, just while they're preparing the next stage of the session, I thought I would say hello. So my name is Gillian Wu and I'm from the Sydney Future Students team. We're hosting this event tonight. We're hoping that you're having a good time and enjoying the session so far. Just a note as well, we will be allowing some time at the end to answer any questions you might have about the content that has been discussed, the examples given from the Chau Chak Wing Museum staff, or about the Master of Museum and Heritage Studies degree, which we offer through the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at the university. So please do feel free to either pop those questions into the chat box, or if you're comfortable, you can also unmute and ask your questions verbally at the end of the session if you wish. So we're so pleased that you could join us, and glad that you're having a good time so far. Eve and Jane will be back with us shortly.
it again. Okay, hi everyone. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to send half the group into breakout room 1 with Timothy and half the group into breakout room 2 with Bronwyn. They are going to describe an object to you that they've seen that you haven't seen, and you are going to need to draw it. And then we're going to come back together and see what everyone has come up with. Okay, so now, all right, as I assign you, you can go into a room. Nearly there. Okay, is everybody back?
Not yet, still.
Let's see how we're going. There's a few more to come.
I clearly get my lefts and rights mixed up often, so some of my directional descriptions would have been a bit off.
Okay, now, so let us go back to here. All right, so we're rushing through that. What I want you to do now, so you've seen this image already because it was up on the screen share, and I know we're running out of time, but we'll see if we can just slip this in time. What I want you to do is go either get your phone, because we're all experts at QR codes now, and scan that QR code, or in another tab on your computer or in your phone, just type in this web link, etc.ch/WY3P. And give me a thumbs up when you're there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A few people in there. I'll give you just another second to get that up. Okay. Now what I want you to do is tell me if that's the one that you drew. Right, so most people are thinking that's the one that they did. Okay, all right. It's a good gauge of what people are thinking. If that was the image that was described to you, then say yes. Now I'm going to show you another artwork, which is that one. So now, if I ask the question again, I know that was very quick, but we don't have too much more time. Now I want you to vote again. Did you draw picture 1 or picture 2? Now it's tipped in the other way. Well, now we're back to 50-50, changing again. So that was just a very, very quick activity to show the points of observation and analysis that can come out. So we've got a few, definitely more people now voting that they drew picture 2 than picture 1. So we've got, this is Il Politico. So these are artworks by Antonio Ferro from Napoli in Italy in 1978. This is Il Politico, and the other one is Il Poeta. So if we had more time, we would look at why is one the poet and one the politician. These are the type of things that we've been doing online with this close type of analysis, but we can't really flesh it out anymore. So I'm going to hand back to you, Gillian, and try and have some questions in the last few minutes remaining.
Thank you, Eve, and sorry all that we had to rush to that final activity. I hope that you've all enjoyed the session this afternoon. As mentioned, we wanted to allow some time for any questions that you might have about the content that we've covered or about the degree, the Master of Museum and Heritage Studies. So if you do, please do feel free to pop them through in the chat box, or otherwise you can raise your hand here to let us know that you'd like to unmute your microphone and ask your question to our wonderful speakers. I might also ask my colleague Sam if you could pop the link to the Master of Museum and Heritage Studies in the chat box, and also the link for the Chau Chak Wing Museum, so that everyone can have that handy. That would be great, Sam. Timothy, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess as we pivot digitally, that does require our audiences to have access to adequate optimized technology and obviously data. And I know this was mentioned in one of the example with the dongles distributed. And whilst digital can increase the accessibility of some collections, talking about the museum with 100% being online versus 3% in the museum, what role do we think institutions play in ensuring that they remain accessible, particularly if they're public collections, if some of our audiences don't have access to that kind of technology?
That's a really great question. I might ask Chiara, would you like to answer that one?
It is a really important question, Tim. And I think that there are some really interesting aspects. I think that everyone realized the importance of digital connectivity in the pandemic, and that we were all, I think, brutally aware of issues around community not being able to access. That I think the library that I gave, the public library actually distributing dongles, that was a librarian who noticed people using the Wi-Fi from the car park. And identified it as a problem. I think in the longer term, the challenge is how do we make sure that the kind of accessibility remains whatever the delivery method, and that there are very big questions around this. I mean, I think some of the lower tech solutions have been actually some of the most successful. So I'm really interested in the program that the MCA's got with phone calls and conversations. But I also think things like podcasts are much less data intensive than a streaming platform, and also asynchronous, so that you're not demanding that someone do it at a particular time, but you're actually leaving it and making it accessible so people can go to the library and use the Wi-Fi or use those sorts of things. So it is a really important question, and it's a very live one, thinking about access and equity into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. Oh, sorry, Eve, go ahead.
Sorry, could I just add in also, I mean, Jane and I have given a couple of presentations about what we've done online and mistakenly left some people with the impression that we have oodles and oodles of money. And that's actually completely not the case. And a lot of the tools that I've shown you, we have only done by making partnerships with people that have the ability to do them. And we've been operating on budget zero for a lot of these. So we have a free account with Sketchfab, for instance, as a cultural heritage institution, a pro account where we maintain the IP, but we've then created a partnership with archaeology, and their photogrammetrist has been doing the photogrammetry for us. The 360-degree virtual tour was a partnership with medicine and health. So there are different resources out there. And it's all about making those connections.
Thanks, Eve. I'm just mindful of the time. We've had one more question come through the chat, which I will read out, but then after that, we'll have to wrap the session. So Rita has asked, how do new museums avoid a sterile atmosphere compared to historical museum spaces? And I guess, Eve and Jane, you've got some direct experience with that, so I might ask you to respond to that one.
I think it's really interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the Nicholson Museum, but that's kind of the big reaction to this incredible concrete box. A lot of people thought of the Chau Chak Wing Museum, which is a very beautiful new modern museum with rats in jars instead of running across the floor. Whereas the Nicholson Museum had all the character of the kind of 19th century collecting. From my perspective, there's no comparison. It's so great. But there was definitely people who felt that the aura of the new museum lacked what the old Nicholson had. And I think it's all about not trying to replicate the space, but really trying to just recreate this incredible experience in a new way, in a new space. Because you can, and because it has the capacity to do so much more and also preserve the objects in such a better way. But that might just be my bias as well, and my fear of rats.
I think many of us might have similar fears, Jane. Thank you for that. So unfortunately, we are out of time. For those of you who might have additional questions, I've left my email address in the chat if you'd like to follow up, and I'd be happy to direct it on to the appropriate staff member to assist. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and a very big thank you to our 4 speakers, Anna Lawrenson, Chiara O'Reilly, Jane Ferguson, and Eve Gary. We hope you enjoyed the session. And if you are interested in hearing more and learning more about this topic, please do check out our Master of Museum and Heritage Studies degree. Thank you all so much again for attending. Hope you have a lovely evening ahead.
Thank you for organising, Gillian, and thanks to Jane and Eve as well, and Chiara for presenting as well, and everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.